Okay, guys, so let's go over this exam question now you've had a go at it. So this is the exam question, populations and conservation, which is your assess task. So this was the exam question that was set, it was back in 2015, and they wouldn't have expected you to have any background knowledge about the relationship between the wolves of Yellowstone and the elk. But the reason I showed you the video clip that you've watched was just to get you actually to sort of see the context of this exam question. What's important to remember, though, is that because you're not expected to have had any of that knowledge, all these types of questions are all looking for you just to apply the same underlying principles of how populations interact together, the fundamental basics of why we do conservation, and the measures that we can take to enable effective conservation to take place. So let's have a look at the question and break it down. This is how you should have done it. So it says the elk, Cervus canadensis, okay, pardon my pronunciation, is a large herbivore, okay? So it's just telling us the name of the elk. We can see its binomial name here with its genus and then its full species name. And we can see you were given figure 2.1. Here's your figure underneath here. We've got figure 2.1 that shows the numbers of elk in Yellowstone National Park between 1965 and 2002, and it tells us how those figures were obtained. So we've got white bars, we can see on our graph here. White bars were the estimated number of elk obtained by ecological sampling. So this is where the population's been deliberately studied using an ecological technique. With the work with Teacher A, you're going to look at some of these techniques, but they may well have been done using a mark capture release technique, where they use that to estimate a population size in a given area. Okay. The other way that they've used to estimate population size is those that were shot legally by hunters. Now, the key bit there, you've always got to remember in any concept of hunting, there'll be legal shooting, where this will be with people with permits and very, very controlled and regulated, and they'll declare what they've obtained by hunting. We've also got to remember that in the background, there may well be illegal hunting and poaching going on in addition to that. Now, the reason that that gives us an indication of the population size and the figures that are there is obviously if there's more elk available to hunt, that suggests that the population size was bigger. It finally gives you a note at the bottom, which is going to be significant for some point in the question. In some years, there were no data for live elk. Okay, now, no data doesn't mean that there were no elk in that situation. It just means they didn't collect the data. And if you see something like that, whether it's in a question like this or any exam question where you're missing data, that has been put on there for a reason. It wants you to recognize the importance of when you're looking at are conclusions valid and what things have you got to look for when you're making those conclusions. Is the data missing? And if there is, always make a comment on it. It'll be somewhere relevant in the question. So the question starts off quite nicely. Using figure 2.1, describe the pattern shown by the data for the estimated number of live elk. Okay, so remember it says live elk are shown by the white bars, so we're only going to be going from the white bars between 1965 and 2002. And we are simply describing the pattern. So we're talking about the overall patterns. We're going to always, when you describe a pattern, you're going to describe it in words, but then you're going to quote some bits of data that reflect the pattern you've seen. So if I show you this bit of data here, just want you to I want to kind of go through with you where the kind of bits that you would pick out. Well, when I look at that data overall, so here we can see 1965 through to 2002, and here is my number of elk up this axis here. I've got my black box representing the number of elk shot legally by hunters, and then our white box are the ones, the number of live elk through the ecological sampling. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at that overall and give a pattern, of what is going on between 1965 and 2002. And my first big thing is that actually, whatever pattern I kind of pick out overall, is that I can see there's lots of fluctuations. Overall, I've got a trend of increase here, okay, between sort of 1965, maybe sort of peaking up in 87. But what I can see, even within given sort of short time periods, I can see quite a lot of fluctuation. Here we've got an increase, but then we've got a dip again, and then we go back up to an increase. So we've got quite a lot of fluctuation. So you're going to pick up 1 mark for having mentioned that actually overall there's fluctuations within the pattern. Now it doesn't really matter where you say that in your answer, but that would be 1 mark point credit. The second thing to sort of point out is that I would say basically you have, we can see looking at those bars, we've got an increase in numbers of live elk from 1965 up to a peak. So if we take the value from this value here, so we've got this increase in value, this increase in trend, and we've probably got peak values at 1988 here and 1994. So you'd get some sort of credit for talking about the population overall has increased with peaks, and you'd pick out one of these peak areas here. What we can see there is that then there generally tends to be a trend of decrease after 1994. Okay, so you will get a mark for talking about either splitting the increase and the decrease up and quoting some numbers, but then you've also got to remember to talk about within that, within the increase and decrease, we do get those fluctuations. Okay, if we look at the overall pattern, because that was what was originally asked about, between 1965 up to 2002, we would say that overall we've got an increase. Now, although we've got a dip down here, our overall trend from this region here to 2002 is a definite increase. So when you describe patterns in data, it's often about picking out the sort of small sections, but also picking out the big bits and the overall trend. I'll just show you here, these were the sort of broken down mark points. We've sort of talked through them all, but there you can see 1 mark for picking out the peak points, and then the fact that we get a decrease after that 1994 value. The overall concept that we've got decrease and then increase between 1988 and 1994. Or picking out that concept of some fluctuations, and then looking at the overall trend between 1965 and 2002, it being an overall increase. So it's a simple describe one, but you've got to remember to pick out the bits of data that best fit and describe the overall pattern. It's no point in talking about every single year on year. You've been asked to describe the overall trends. Okay, so this next question is a little bit about reading the question. It helps you a long way to help you answer it. So here it says, the recorded number of elk legally shot by hunters provides accurate data. Suggests why these data are accurate, but the method used to obtain these data is not valid. As a valid way of estimating the number of elk in the population. So this one here is, you've got to think, well, what does that word accurate mean? Well, accurate, we know, is close to the true value. Well, we know that if hunters are going out, shooting, killing and bringing back these dead elk, then the actual number that you're recording is the number that was shot dead. So you don't get truer to the true value than the actual number that was shot dead. It's, you know, it's right there in terms of accuracy. However, it's not a valid way of estimating the number of elk in the population, because it doesn't actually give us a sort of a true kind of representative value. What we've got to think of is there are a number of things here that might make a difference, and I'll show you all the different ones that are allowed on the mark scheme in a second. But what we've got to remember is that the amount or the number of elk shot is all to do with hunting success. Okay, and it actually isn't necessarily due to the population size. So maybe they were doing hunting, but they only issued, because it's legal hunting, maybe they only issued a certain number of permits to a certain number of hunters, therefore they only had the capacity to shoot so many of them. Maybe, you know, it was a really harsh winter, and as a result the hunters didn't go out or couldn't go out to hunt them. The other thing we've got to remember is when we're using hunting as a method of counting the population, the ones that are hunted and killed are probably more likely not to be fully representative of a full spectrum of the population. So the ones that are going to be hunted and killed are probably going to be either the really young ones or the older, the diseased elk that can't escape the hunter as effectively. So you're not actually getting a valid way of counting and representing the total population because of the mechanism that you used. So the mark scheme looks like this. You get 1 mark for talking about why it is accurate. So anything along the lines of the fact that, you know, it's accurate because the elk that are shot are the ones that are counted. So you get a level of accuracy, but it's not valid. And you get any credit for talking about any of the valid reasons. The fact that actually there are so many factors that can affect the amount of hunting that was allowed, it's not going to get you a fully representative and valid way of counting. Okay, so for our next question, we've got the sort of long answer question for this single question. Now, this is a 7 marker, and obviously in the new style questions, you wouldn't get a 7 marker, but these are very, very similar in terms of their structure of the 6 markers, okay? So in this one here, we can see that we've got the grey wolf, Canis lupus, there's its binomial name, is a large predator whose diet includes the elk. Now, always remember, if it includes the elk, elk's going to be one thing it's consuming, but it could well be consuming other things. By 1926, the grey wolves had been hunted to extinction in Yellowstone National Park. So we saw on the video sort of some background to that. However, this species could still be found in other parts of the world. So it wasn't totally extinct, and they did have a pool that they could go to be able to replace it. I'm just going to have to go and switch my dishwasher off, otherwise that's going to keep beeping. Hold on. Okay, I'm back. So in 1995, a population of grey wolves was introduced to Yellowstone Park, and their numbers increased. Okay, so they introduced a relatively small population, and fairly quickly over time, the wolf population increased significantly. So it says, with reference to figure 2.1, so we're going to go back to this figure in a sec, discuss the factors that may have affected the size of the elk population before 95 and after 95. Okay, in your answer, you should provide a balanced account referring to factors before and after. Now, key bit here, it's telling us to be balanced, so we need to make sure we've given some good discussion points for before and some good discussion points for after. And remember, it's asking us about the size of the elk population. So if you're asked any question on population sizes, you need to be making sure that you're talking about limiting factors. Okay, and you need to make sure that you're talking about that carrying capacity. Now, you're going to pick up exam credit in this type of question by just getting those keywords in and explaining how they relate to it. So let's have a look at the data on the graph before we start putting our answer together. So here's your overall graph. I'm getting most of it in the picture. And on this part here, we can see in 1995, there was our introduction or reintroduction of the wolves. And they were reintroduced at a point where the elk population was really, really high, okay? We can see this was 1965, so this is pre-data that we need to talk about what was happening with the wolf population. And then this is our post-1995 data, okay? So the first thing I would always talk about in this type of situation is that population size of the elk is going to be determined by a number of limiting factors. So what you need to have a look at is what's happening to the population size before 1995. And what we can see is that the population size is increasing before 1995. So therefore, actually, there must not be a particular factor that's limiting that growth. So you might talk about the fact that there are plenty of food sources available. We know because the wolves had been hunted to extinction, there was a lack of predation. There was no competition or less competition for space. So they were not having this massive human impact, massive impact from other organisms. There may also have been less hunting from humans of the elk themselves in that given situation. Okay, so before 1995, what we can then see, so that's why we get this increase here. Then before 1995, although we've got some peaks kind of in these regions here, if you look at this data sort of between here and here, actually, it's fairly level. If you almost go increase, 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 leveling off, we might start to say, well, actually, here we can see that before 1995, it had started to level off and reach the carrying capacity of the population, where population size is remaining relatively stable. So in this point here, perhaps actually the population size isn't increasing further because there is intra-specific competition. So those elk will be competing with each other for food sources, potentially in that given area, territory, mates. So it actually starts to level off. So this would be your increasing population where there isn't really a particular limiting factor. And here we can see here before 1995, we're at the carrying capacity of the population, and there is intra-specific competition that's taking place. What we can then see is that within that, you might talk about the fact that population size within those regions does fluctuate a little bit. So, you know, sometimes here we can see a dip here. We might get a dip in a given year due to some sort of, I don't know, really harsh winter that killed off lots of young, you know, preceding years. And as a result, that has an impact. Okay. What we need to make sure that we do, because we've talked quite a lot about pre-1995, is to start to look at post-1995 when those wolves were increased. Now, what we can see is post-1995, the general trend is a decrease, okay? And so that general decrease is probably due to the presence and that reintroduction of the wolves, okay? Now, what we've got to think about though, and this is where they always, you know, if they've missed out some data, you need to be commenting in it. So obviously here, we don't have any data here. We can't see what the trends were going on here. Maybe they introduced the wolves here and actually population numbers were really high. So the lack of data basically in 1996 and 97 makes it really difficult to make an overall conclusion that actually it was the presence of the wolves that was causing that decline. Okay, so I'll show you the marking points on the mark scheme to take it through, but they're the type of things that you should be looking for or should have been looking for in your answer. So you can see this is the mark scheme that was put out, and so these were the potential marking points. There was a maximum of 6, even though there was 9 marks. But what you need to remember is that when you break this down, you need to have probably, I would say, at least like 2 to 3 of the marks talking about what was happening post 1995, and maybe 4 marks talking about pre 1995. So it will take you through each of those bits. Don't forget, for these 2 mark points here, you needed to actually have the keyword in there. Where a keyword is underlined in a mark scheme, it means you must use that exact term. And in any long answer question, they are going to be looking for that use of the correct terminology. So it isn't just enough to say the fact that something was increased, something was stopping the population size getting any bigger. For carrying, you need to say that it's at its carrying capacity. So you pick out those bits. So hopefully you can see kind of the breakdown there. And the QWC in this mark was about getting across the idea that you had both sides of the argument in. Okay, so you talked about what was happening pre-95 and what was happening post-95, and if you did that, you could get 1 mark. Well, if you're disciplined with your question and make sure you talk about both sides, you'd have picked up that 1 mark kind of automatically. Okay, and then for the final question, it says, explain why the introduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in 95 is an example of conservation. Okay, so for this question, you've got to be really thinking, what do we mean by conservation? Well, ultimately, conservation is going to have 2 big things at its essence. It's about maintaining biodiversity, if possible, or restoring biodiversity. So if you try and restore an ecosystem to its original form, prior to the human impact, so before the wolves started to be so hunted by humans, then that's going to be conservation. So you're going to get credit for almost showing that you understand what conservation means and how it's relevant here. Now, in doing so, if you think about, right, how does what they've done help to act as a conservation measure? Well, we know that if you introduce these wolves back from another part of the world into Yellowstone, obviously the wolf population is going to increase. So it's going to increase the biodiversity by encouraging a new population. Now, what we know from the video is that actually, just in increasing the wolf population, we had a massive impact on all of those other species. So the wolves caused the elk, not only in hunting them and acting as a predator to them to reduce their numbers, but it caused them to behave differently. So they redistributed themselves to different parts of the national park. And as a result of that, there was able to be regeneration of certain shrubs and grasses in those areas where the elk had now moved away from. And because of that, new insects arrived, new birds were then able to arrive, and predators of those birds could then come back. So the actual impact was absolutely massive. The other element that you can get some credit for is the fact of almost showing that you understand the difference between conservation and preservation. So we know that introduction of the wolves is an active management method. If we were just preserving it, what they would do would be to kind of just let things go back and get on and almost allow a natural development back to the original ecosystem. Whereas what's happened here is that wolves have been actively taken from an area and put into that area. And then in this situation, what they might do is do things to encourage and make it more, make the wolves be more able to breed, to actually sort of encourage that population to increase. So you're going to get credit for showing that you understand that conservation is active management, whereas preservation is almost reducing human interference, almost allowing the ecosystem just to naturally return to its normal situation. The other little bits that you could get some additional credit for in this one, I know it's worth 2 marks, there's so much you could say for this, is that actually in doing the reason when you introduce the wolves, another way that it's conservation is pointing out that actually the wolves will then predate the elk, and as a result of that, you reduce the population of elk, and so you prevent them overgrazing. So you could get a little bit of credit for adding in some extra detail there. But hopefully, you went along. When you look at these questions, you've got to think, because you're going to have an unseen example, but you've got to apply just the general principles. And so it's about you understanding the theory and then applying it in that given situation. So if I show you what the mark scheme looked like, here we've got, that idea of stating basically the fundamental principles of why we do conservation. And so in terms of restoring the ecosystem, well, we're helping the wolf population come back into that ecosystem and increasing its biodiversity because we've added in another population. The fact that it is active management and maintenance, so it's humans actively doing something to try and improve and restore the ecosystem rather than just letting nature take its course. And then a little bit of extra detail, as I said, about what it actually does to the elk population by means of the measures they've taken. Okay, so hopefully that question makes sense. What I want you to do is make sure all of these answers have been purple penned onto your test, and then you need to make sure you've scanned in your tests so that I can see your marking of it and just double check and check that you've got the marks that you have and that you've added in those improvements there. Okay.